Jalon Walker has the potential to be a top 5 pass rusher in the NFL.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another illustrious episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by Monarch Money. Take control of your finances with Monarch Money by using code LOCKEDONNFL at monarchmoney.com for 50% off your first year. So if you don't know me, I'm your very humble host, Aaron Freeman, a.k.a. Sirius Black, a.k.a. the iron that sharpens the iron, a.k.a. Mr. a.k.a. And I've been covering the Atlanta Falcons for a very long time, formerly at falcfans.com. RIP, still going strong on this illustrious podcast. And I thank each and every one of you that goes strong with me as everydayers. That means you make this podcast your first listen each and every day, and all you have to do to become an everydayer is subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. So today we are doing our comprehensive Jalon Walker scouting report. We'll look at 3 NFL comparisons, including a Pro Bowl pass rusher that was top 5 at his peak in terms of the potential ceiling of Jalon Walker in this league. We'll talk about his role, his fit in Atlanta's scheme and defense, and whether or not Atlanta has the environment that's going to potentially mean so much for Jalon Walker's development and future here in Atlanta. But we'll start off talking strengths, weaknesses, his pass rush profile. But let's get into the biographic information. Hometown, Salisbury, North Carolina, just north of Charlotte, son of a coach, Curtis Walker Sr., former head coach of Catawba College, a D2 school in Salisbury, one of the top recruits in the nation, a 5-star recruit, went to Georgia, obviously. Still a young player, just turned 21 in February, standing at 6'1", 243 pounds. And, at Georgia, started out as a rush linebacker, as a true freshman, earning some snaps, particularly late in that season on their Georgia's national championship playoff run back in 2022. Got more opportunities in that same role in 2023 as a sophomore, primarily as a designated or situational pass rusher, and was mostly on the field in those situations in third and medium, third and long, obvious passing situations. In those first 2 seasons, according to PFF, spent about 60% of his snaps playing edge, 40% playing linebacker, but Georgia wanted to get him more opportunities on the field going into his junior year in 2024, and they basically flipped it, where 60% of his snaps came as an off-ball linebacker, 40% as an edge rusher, primarily playing that off-ball linebacker role on early downs, and that edge rusher role on passing situations, but still a healthy percentage of those linebacker snaps coming as a pass rusher, about 20% of those total linebacker snaps rushing the quarterback. Went back and watched 16 games with Jalon Walker over the last 2 years, 5 from 23, 11 from 24. And I'm really glad I did go back and watch the 23 film, because to me, particularly as a pass rusher, it was just more impressive in 23 when he was a true edge rusher versus this past year. And it was one of the reasons why I was so low on Walker initially pre-draft, because just watching his 24 film, I didn't really see him as a first-round talent, which I know is going to be a shock to so many people. But by the end of today's episode, you'll at least have a better understanding of why I thought that, even if you don't necessarily agree with that. Now, I did eventually become higher on Jalon Walker, spoiler alert, as we went through the film. But, talking about the film, the strengths, the weaknesses of him, good speed, whether that's as a pursuit linebacker or having that first step quickness as an edge rusher off the edge, a very powerful, compact build, knows how to come downhill, attack blocks, plays with a relentless motor, very high character by all accounts, A++ character coming from that coaching son background and whatnot. The weaknesses for Jalon Walker, really just the size is the main one, right? Standing 6'1", that's second percentile for an edge rusher. 243 is 6th percentile for an edge rusher. His arm length of 32 inches is 6th percentile. His wingspan of 79 and 7/8 inches, so roughly about 80 inches, is about 43rd wingspan. So that's why you hear people like Derek Klassen come on the podcast and talk about him being longer, even though that arm length in and of itself is not particularly good. Now, when you project those same measurements to the linebacker position, looking at websites like mockdraftable.com, that height is 31st percentile, weight 68th, wingspan 79th, arm length 41st percentile. So much more average size for a linebacker, but sort of in the single digits in terms of a size profile as an edge rusher. And the reality is there aren't just that many edge rushers at his size that are successful in the NFL. And that makes Jalon Walker potentially an outlier. Now, he plays tougher than his size, but that size does show up on film. The more and more you watch film, particularly when it comes to disengaging from blocks, that lack of length does show up time and time again, particularly when he's facing offensive tackles. I thought he did a much better job stacking and shedding guards and centers when he was playing an off-ball linebacker against the run than he did playing as an edge rusher. Too often getting a little bit engulfed, and it's not going to get easier making the jump from even the SEC to the NFL level. But when we look at him, potentially as a linebacker, not just an edge rusher, a full-time linebacker, in terms of things that he can probably clean up if he does eventually make that transition. We'll talk more about that later in today's episode. But I think he can clean up his tackling a little bit. I don't think his instincts are great. They're just kind of okay. And I think given the relative lack of experience playing as a true linebacker, I think his instincts are probably better than you would expect, given that sort of intelligence that he plays with. But the other issue as a true linebacker is, he only did basic things in coverage, and the complexities of what he's going to be asked to do in the NFL as a off-ball linebacker in coverage is going to have a significant learning curve. So there is a ways for him to go as a linebacker if the Falcons go down that path, but we'll talk more about that potentially later. Now, the other question with Jalon Walker is how athletic is he, right? He looks pretty athletic on film, but we never saw him tested due to a quad strain that he suffered during training in the pre-draft process. And particularly when you're talking about a player that is a potential size outlier, you feel a lot better betting on that size outlier if he's a rare athlete. If he's a 90th or 95th or 99th percentile athlete, you look at guys like Micah Parsons and Aaron Donald, who are those sort of size outliers for their respective positions and are that sort of elite one-of-one athlete. And I don't know if Jalon Walker is quite on that level as an athlete just watching the film. And unfortunately, we did not get, any measurables in terms of his testing to either indicate yes or no in that regard. But when we talk about Jalon Walker and his pass rush profile, going back and watching the film, in the 5 games I saw in 23, charted 22 wins. In the 11 games I saw in 24, charted 52 wins. 20 of those wins in 23 came as an edge rusher, only 2 at linebacker. But in 24, you had a much more even split with about 28 wins at edge versus 24 at linebacker. And with Walker in 23, about 45% of those wins were speed rushes, 10% power, 20% counter, 5% technical moves, and 20% other, which basically refers to times where he's like unblocked or stunts and schemed and whatnot. And those technical moves are basically when he wins with his hands. Counter moves are basically when he tries to attack outside and then counters often with like a swim move or whatnot, or a spin move or something like that in terms of those counter moves. Now in 24, you saw much more power in his profile, 25% speed, 39% power, 7% counter moves, no technical moves, and 29% other. And when you combine those 2 years together, Jalon Walker's, in terms of how his wins broke down, 33% of them were speed, 27% power, 13% were counter moves, 2% technical, and 25% other. And when I look back at the 4 edge rushers that the Falcons have drafted over the last 3 drafts, or the previous 3 drafts, in D'Angelo Malone, Arnold Ebiketie, Braylon Trice, and Zach Harrison, that profile, that combined profile for Jalon Walker is very much more similar to D'Angelo Malone, right? D'Angelo Malone in his 21 season, my breakdown had him 31% of his wins were speed, 21% power, 21% counter, 3% technical, and 26% other. And so very similar across the board in terms of Jalon Walker's combined pass rush success at Georgia the last 2 years in the games I saw. So, basically the way it broke down for Jalon Walker is overwhelmingly in 23, he was winning with speed. And as I said earlier, that to me was his best film. In 2024, he relied a lot more on his power, particularly that long arm pass rush move. And I think the long arm is a nice tool to have in your toolkit, but I don't know if it's your go-to move, especially when you have some of the length concerns that Jalon Walker is going to have, where your average NFL offensive tackle is going to have like 34-inch arms. He's not going to really be able to outreach those guys. But you saw a much more diverse array of pass rush moves in 2023, which again is contributing to why I thought that film was better. particularly with the speed rushes, you saw a ghost move, you saw a cross chop, you saw those inside swim moves that accounted for that higher degree of counter moves that he showed in 2023. So, ultimately how it all translates, we talk a lot up on this podcast over the last year about when it comes to projecting and developing these players, that power translates. That's the thing we've mentioned a number of times, that NFL offensive tackles, when you talk to them, they will tell you that they're most worried about guys going through them with that power. We look at a guy like Jared Verse, who had, a historic great year as a rookie, as a defensive rookie of the year, primarily using that power. And we saw how quickly that translated. And it's not a coincidence that the second most productive pass rusher from last year's draft class was Chop Robinson, who did a great job converting that speed to power. And we're hoping that Walker can do a similar thing, that, speed to power, force equals mass times acceleration. I think Jalon Walker is going to have to polish that a little bit, particularly like his bull rush. He has a tendency for his legs to kind of go dead upon contact. And for those of you that don't know, with a bull rush and other power-based moves, you're generating most of that power in your lower half. And so you need those legs to keep driving. It's no different than hitting a blocking sled and just driving that guy off the ball. And Jalon Walker needs to be better about that. But again, that's very teachable when it comes to that. And so we believe that his power can translate, but I do think primarily his most fearsome attribute is going to be that speed at the next level. I think that's going to really challenge more NFL offensive tackles than necessarily his power, given the amount of mass he's giving up, And I think that's going to lead to Jalon Walker needing to improve his hands, right? That's another big factor when it comes to his development as a pass rusher, not only as a pass rusher improving his hands, but also when it comes to defending the run and setting the edge, just because he's going to have a disadvantage due to giving up so much mass, giving up some of that length on the outside. And he's just going to struggle, I think, a little bit to win purely off of physicality. And so it's just basically, you can't block what you can't hit, right? It's wax on, wax off. Keep those offensive tackles from getting their hands on him, because once they do, because of the size and the length that they have, they're going to be able to control more of those, particularly NFL offensive linemen who aren't going to lose that many reps like that. And so if you're Jalon Walker, you're just, just swatting hands and all that stuff. So if he can develop improved hand use, I think, that gives him a greater chance of being that sort of every down defender, not only in being impactful pass rusher, but also being reliable enough as a run defender. It's not a lack of desire or toughness or willingness as a run defender. It's just simply a lack of size. But when we talk about those things with Jalon Walker, let's talk more in depth about what role he's going to have in Atlanta, because it's going to be at least relatively unique in year one. And it's going to matter a whole lot sort of long-term in terms of Jalon Walker's development, whether he's going to be an edge rusher or, are we going to be talking about him down the road, potentially as a linebacker, as a full-time every down linebacker, similar to Caden Ellis. And we'll get into all of that, guys, as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. So do you ever look at your bank account and wonder, where did all my money go? And between dining out, online shopping, entertainment, it's easy to lose track. And that's where Monarch Money comes in, your personal CFO, giving you full visibility and control over your finances. Monarch Money isn't just any old budgeting app. It's a complete financial command center. You can track all your accounts, investments, and spending all in one place, and even plan long-term goals so you can stop managing your money and start actually building wealth. Take control of your finances with Monarch Money by using code LOCKEDONNFL at monarchmoney.com, and you'll get 50% off your first year. That's monarchmoney.com, code LOCKEDONNFL. That's LOCKEDONNFL for half off your first year. So the Falcons have already sort of communicated what they intend Jalon Walker's role to be. He's going to start out primarily as an edge rusher. And that will probably be a stand-up edge in their wide 9 scheme. And we discussed a little bit of what that scheme is going to look like with Cody Alexander of Match Quarters last week, a couple of episodes ago. But the Falcons have also mentioned that they do plan on potentially having him and having the flexibility and openness to have him dabble as an off-ball rusher, right? Where he's going to line up in that A gap or B gap, similar to how the Falcons utilize Caden Ellis on obvious passing situations. And, for the rest of today's episode, the shorthand for that specific role as a stand-up linebacker, we're going to call the Caden Ellis role, even if it's not all the things that Caden Ellis does for this defense as a true off-ball linebacker. But, one of the concerns with the scheme fit with Jalon Walker is, he fits better in a scheme that has a 5-man front versus a 4-man front, which we talked about extensively with Cody Alexander on that recent episode of the podcast. And the reason why that matters is just simple math, right? If we're going to oversimplify here, but typically on any given run play, right, you're going to have 6 blockers, right? 5 offensive linemen and a tight end. And against a 5-man front, it's going to be harder to double team those edges, right? Typically, because you have 6 guys blocking 5, the guy that's going to get double teamed in that situation is that nose tackle lined up over the center and the guard in the A gap, right? But in the 4-man front, you have 6 blockers, and it's a much easier because you don't have that nose tackle. The center and the guard can double team one of the D tackles, and then the tackle and the tight end are much easier to double team that edge rusher. And so theoretically, when we say like, oh, I think Jalon Walker is a better fit in a 5-man front, it's because it's less likely that he'll be facing those types of double teams where his size could be more of a liability. And so that's why in a 5-man front, when you're playing a 4-3 under or 3-4 type of defense, he fits a little bit better in that than as a 4-man front where he's going to be true of an edge rusher. But as we talked about with Cody Alexander, go check out that episode if you haven't checked it out to get the skinny on this Falcons scheme under Jeff Ulbrich. The expectation is the Falcons are going to play both 5 and 4-man fronts this year. It's just a question of which one do they major in. And as Cody said in that episode, it basically all depends on, whether or not the players can execute one versus the other. If one works better, then they'll lean towards one or the other. But, when it comes to sort of Jalon Walker's fit in this role that we're outlining for him, one of the questions we have is, is he going to get Cadenellist, using that as a verb, right? Where he's going to be moved from a true blue edge rusher to more of an off-ball linebacker. We talked about this with Cadenellist, given his size issues, similar size as Jalon Walker, about 6'2", 240. When he got drafted by the Saints, 7 years ago, 6-7 years ago, whenever it was, he wasn't big enough to play defensive end in their 4-3 front under defensive coordinator Dennis Allen and, of course, D-line coach Ryan Nielsen, who would later become the Falcons defensive coordinator, because those guys want size up front. And the reason why they want size up front is because, you're going to be playing nickel over 60% of the time in today's NFL. And about 60%, over 60% of all run plays come against nickel defenses, right? And nickel, you're typically playing, with 4 down linemen, 2 off-ball linebackers, and 5 defensive backs. You're going to be lighter up front. You're going to only have 6 guys in the box, accounting for 6 blockers plus the running back and whatnot. So you're going to be at a disadvantage from a number standpoint defending the run when you're playing in nickel. And so because you're also replacing a linebacker in your base defense, a 230-pound linebacker with a 190-pound slot corner, you want to kind of counterbalance that lack of mass that you're going to now have in your front with having bigger bodies up front on your defensive line, right? And that's the heart of sort of why the Ryan Nielsens and the Dennis Allens and so many other defensive coordinators want bigger, longer, stronger bodies up front. And Cadenellist, we've talked about this before with Cadenellist, where he's most effective as a off-ball, rushing those A gaps, matching up against centers and guards and running backs as a blitzer through those A and B gaps than he is as a true edge rusher. If you look at like next gen stats this past year, Cadenellist's pressure rate was 2.5 times higher, as that off-ball rusher than it was as a true edge rusher, right? And the previous year was 3 times higher as that off-ball linebacker than as a true edge rusher, which is why you always hear me, scoff when people are like, we should move Cadenellist full-time to edge rusher. It's like, you're going to limit him as a playmaker in that role. Like his pressure rate as a pure edge rusher is closer to like D'Angelo Malone and Lorenzo Carter than it is as a true difference maker. It's safe to assume that a player like Jalon Walker is probably a better athlete than Cadenellist, but the question is how much better, right? Cadenellist, when you project his athleticism and his explosiveness as an edge rusher, was like a 70th percentile athlete. And you compare that to other sort of undersized edge rushers, like Haason Reddick, who's more 90th percentile, Micah Parsons, who's like 95th plus percentile. And so the question is, where does Walker fit on this spectrum? Now, again, just guessing off of the film without having the confirmation from the numbers, I would say Walker is better than Ellis, but I don't know if he's quite on the same level as Haason Reddick. So let's say he's like an 80th percentile sort of athlete in terms of his explosiveness off the edge. And is that good enough? What is the threshold? Again, is it, 70th percentile is not good enough to be a full-time edge rusher, but 90th is. And so where does 80th percentile fit into that paradigm? We don't quite know that. And so, and just watching the film, it does feel like Jalon Walker from a size standpoint is going to do a much better job, similar to Cadenellist, rushing against guards and centers and running backs than he is against offensive tackles, given some of the size and length concerns that he's given up. And so it does lead to questions over whether eventually, like Caden Ellis, do we eventually move him to a full-time linebacker long-term if that proves to be true, as we try to get him more opportunities on the football field, if his best film is rushing those A and B gaps rather than rushing on the outside. Now, Jalon Walker has all the intangibles and character and all that stuff that, if he does make that transition to linebacker and successfully makes that transition to linebacker, he could be like Caden Ellis, a guy that could be your Mike, calling the defense, wearing the green dot and all that stuff. And again, the size concerns are much less because it's average. He has average linebacker size compared to him as an edge rusher. But, the real issue that we're going to have to see is, can he basically offset that potential move if he's, very productive as an edge rusher immediately early in his career? Time is going to tell on that. But the thing that gives me pause is, like, we look at how Jeff Ulbrich, how Raheem Morris plan on using him. But the question that, no one wants to talk about is what happens if Jeff Ulbrich and Raheem Morris aren't around at some point in the near future, right? We already know that this coaching staff is on a warm seat, hot seat, depending on your perspective on it. They got to win this year or else. And we know what or else means in the NFL, not for long. You're going to be, not the head coach here in Atlanta. And so the question I have, and again, it's unknown at this time. We don't know how it's going to all play out. We're all hoping that the Falcons win and we don't have to have this conversation in earnest, but it is worth mentioning that, what happens if a different coaching staff comes into this building, whether that's in 2026 or in the future, that doesn't have the same vision for Jalon Walker as this current coaching staff does. And we talk all the time about nature versus nurture when it comes to quarterback development, right? But it also applies to all positions, right? It's easier for you to develop in a nurturing environment where you can master the same scheme, the same role with the same coaching staff, and that improves your chances of developing in this league than, as we've seen with a number of Falcon players these last couple of years, where, Arnold Bichetti and D'Angelo Malone and Zach Harrison have all had different defensive coordinators every single year they've been in the NFL. You don't think that's a coincidence that the Falcons have struggled to develop players not only recently, but over the last decade, right? Jeff Ulbrich is the 7th defensive coordinator in 8 years. He's the 8th defensive coordinator in 10 years, right? And given all the turnover and schemes and coaches and fits and whatnot, it's not a coincidence that the Falcons have struggled to develop defensive players in that period of time. And so, I know some of you guys are going to dislike the tone of today's episode. It's going to be too negative, but we have serious conversations on this podcast. That's why I'm also known as Serious Black, because we talk seriously about all of these things. And basically, I'm trying to explain to you why, over the last 10 minutes of this podcast, why it's taken 25 years for the Falcons to develop a pass rusher since Patrick Curdy, right? These are some of the reasons why, right? That, if you want to sit here and convince yourself that it's just the Falcons just haven't drafted the right players yet. And now Jalon Walker is the right player, but it's like the environment matters a lot more than people realize, right? And so we'll see on that. And so Jalon Walker is going to have to overcome a lot of these obstacles and hurdles. He has the capability of doing so, but hopefully Jalon Walker will overcome those hurdles, and that will lead him to reaching his full potential here in Atlanta. And that's going to get to where we end today's episode, talking about some NFL player comparisons when we talk about his floor, his ceiling, and his eye level as he projects to the next level. And we'll break that down as we wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. So for those of you that are new here, we've been doing this pretty consistently on this podcast since 2018. We do 3 NFL player comparisons, talking about not only stylistically what the player is, but also these projections are also trying to sort of project the potential outcomes for these players. And because you don't know about the circumstances for players, things that are out of the player's control, like the scheme and personnel changes and injuries, it's hard to be very specific. And so we just say, okay, this is a spread, right? And we start with the floor. That is what the player is entering the NFL. That's immediately what you expect that player to be. Again, I stress every year when we do this, this is the most important part of the conversation, because what your floor is going to allow you to do is to get on the field immediately and contribute. And if you get on the field and can play, you can develop. No one develops from the bench, right? So what you can contribute right away is going to really determine your success and failure as an NFL player more so than anything else. Now, at the opposite end of the spectrum, we have the ceiling. That's the max potential a player has, in my eyes, with 3, 4, 5 or more years of development, basically the best case scenario when it comes to not only the player's nature, but also going to the most nurturing environment. What does he have the potential to be? And then the eye level is that midway point between the floor and the ceiling, which I think is generally the more accurate projection for a player, because, we can assume that the player will get some development, right? So that he'll exceed his floor, but may not necessarily get the full development to reach his ceiling. And, while everybody else obsesses about ceiling, we try to focus on the floor here. But I've been doing these player comps since about 2018 for every player the Falcons have picked. And only about, I can't remember the exact number we talked about last summer, but it was only roughly about 15% of the players that reached or exceeded their ceilings. And so that's one of the reasons why I tend not to be nearly as optimistic as other people are when it comes to projecting players in their ceilings, just because, these facts and this hard data is kind of staring me in the face, where it's like an 85% chance that they don't reach that. But talking about Jalon Walker's floor, the comp I have is Jeremiah Atachu, who is a second-round pick out of the Chargers, out of Georgia Tech back in 2014. Similar undersized player, about 6'3", 250. Spent 9 years in the NFL as a backup special teams player, was a productive pass rusher in limited work, only played about 2,100 snaps on defense across his NFL career, about 35% of the snaps he could have played in, similar to what Lorenzo Carter's usage was this past year. Across those 9 seasons, Atachu had 20.5 sacks, so only about 2 sacks per year, averaged about 14 pressures per year. So those aren't that impressive numbers. But when you look at the 1 year that Atachu got an opportunity to start in the league, he had 6 sacks and 48 pressures, which is good production. Unfortunately for him, the following year, the Chargers drafted Joey Bosa. And so he became a backup despite that success, playing behind Joey Bosa and Melvin Ingram, 2 first-round picks for the Chargers. Now, Atachu, again, was very productive in limited opportunities, started 23 games across his NFL career, had 11 sacks in those 23 games. So you extrapolate that over a 17-game season as a starter, he would have been an 8-sack guy based off of that production. But after, his departure from the Chargers after 4 years, basically became a journeyman. So when I look at a guy like Jalon Walker, that to me is what I think he can be right away, be productive as a limited role player, as a pass rusher, right? Atachu was an okay run defender, not good enough in that regard to, basically say like, oh, well, we're going to get him a ton of opportunities because he's a plus run defender. And so that can keep our pass rushers fresher. But overall, a solid role player. And that's what I expect Jalon Walker to be right away. But at the opposite end of the spectrum, when we look at the best case scenario for Jalon Walker, my comp is Haason Reddick, right? One of those rare undersized edge rushers, those outlier, about 6'1", sub 240, I think, when he came into the NFL as a first round pick. Very explosive first step, and hopefully Walker can hone that speed rush. And if he does, I think he can reach the similar ceiling to what Haason Reddick was in his prime. Now, Reddick had an interesting career path because he was mostly an edge rusher in college, but then he got converted due to those size concerns to more of an off-ball linebacker in the NFL, eventually moved back full-time to edge rusher in his final year in Arizona in 2020. And blossomed in that role. And you look at that season, the 1 year he spent in Carolina under Matt Rule, and the 2 years that he spent in 22 and 23 in Philadelphia, he played about 75% of the snaps there. So was more of a full-time player, averaged about 12.5 sacks and 60 pressures across those 4 years. And there was only 4 other edge rushers in the NFL during that 4-year span that hit 50 plus sacks like Reddick did during that 4-year span. And that's where, the potential to be a top 5 edge rusher, Haason Reddick at his peak production produced like a top 5 edge rusher. So I think Walker can reach that potential if he winds up being that 90th percentile athlete that Haason Reddick was when it came to that explosiveness. He hones his speed rush. Reddick really developed the cross chop, was able to really develop his hands. It took Reddick some time, in part due to the role that he was asked to play, being more of an off-ball linebacker his first 3 years, but also he didn't really develop that cross chop until after he left Arizona, once he was able to put in that time as a full-time edge rusher. And we're hoping that Walker will be able to put in that time and be a full-time edge rusher, so therefore can hit that Haason Reddick ceiling. We won't have to wait till year 4 or 5 or whatever with Walker. Maybe we get that in years 2 and year 3. But when we talk about the more realistic projection for what I think Jalon Walker is going to be, given what he's going to be asked to do early on, my eye level comp for Jalon Walker is Bryce Huff. And I stole that from Jeff Ulbrich, but the more and more I watch, I'm like, yeah, it fits, right? Bryce Huff, another 6'1", sub 240 guy, shorter arms than Jalon Walker, developed into one of the top designated pass rushers in the NFL in that Jets wide nine scheme under Jeff Ulbrich when he was defensive coordinator there. But he was not an every down player, only, again, playing about 35% of snaps across those 4 years in New York. Very productive in those snaps. You look at the raw numbers, only 4.5 sacks, 33 pressures on average across those 4 years in New York. Not wowing you, but very productive on a per snap basis. His win rates, according to PFF, he was number 1 in the NFL with the highest win rate among edge rushers in 2022 and number 3 in the NFL in 2023. And basically it's only Micah Parsons and Myles Garrett that were in a similar conversation, similar tier in terms of their win rates across those 2 seasons. And so despite the production as a pass rusher, the issues with Bryce Huff was the limitations as a run defender. And that it got exposed as he left for basically swapping places with Haason Reddick, one guy going from New York to Philly and the other one going from Philly to New York. And that got exposed this past year. Philly gave him a big contract thinking, we're just going to get a younger version of Haason Reddick. And he started this past season as a starter, but the Eagles' run defense was really struggling in those first 2 games against the Falcons, against the Packers. And again, that's not all on Bryce Huff, but he was a contributing factor to that. And unfortunately, unlike in New York, he couldn't compensate with being a very productive pass rusher to justify keeping him on the field, right? He was only 70th in win rate over the first month of this 2024 season among edge rushers. And so basically he kind of got lost in the shuffle and was essentially benched by the end of the season. It was a huge bust by the Eagles, and it didn't bother the Eagles. They went on to win the Super Bowl and played great defense despite Bryce Huff being a quote unquote bust because they're loaded with other pass rushers. And so if they whiff on a guy like Bryce Huff, then no big deal. They got plenty of other guys. Now we're hoping we're going to get there one day with the Atlanta Falcons with James Pierce and Ruka Roro and Arnold Bichetti and whatnot when it comes to this Falcons pass rush group. But you do wonder a little bit where there's going to be a little bit more focus on a guy like Jalon Walker to be the guy, here in Atlanta, where the Falcons don't have that sort of safety net like the Eagles have quite yet. Again, we're hoping we're getting there one day. So with Huff, he was a piece of the puzzle. Was extremely productive in New York, but still was like the 3rd or 4th edge in their rotation. And when you factor in the D tackles like Quentin Williams, was really like 5th or 6th in the rotation. I think that's, to me, the more realistic projection for Jalon Walker, unless he can truly develop and hone that pass rush like Haason Reddick did. And again, the concern with Huff is that he was extremely productive and useful, but he had to be in a very specific role in the right scheme. And I think that's going to be the concern with Walker. Extremely useful, but has to play in the right scheme, the right role, similar to guys like Huff and Reddick. And again, that's not going to fit everybody. And so the concern with that is if, there are different schemes, right? That's a fit for right now what the Falcons want to do, but will that be a fit long-term for the Falcons? And so, potentially, again, if we're projecting him as a linebacker, giving that eye level and ceiling comp as a pure every down linebacker, if that is eventually the path that Jalon Walker plays, my ceiling comp for him is Demario Davis. My eye level is Frankie Louvu. Davis and Louvu basically both took time to hit. Louvu came into the league as an edge rusher under Todd Bowles with the Jets, departed New York, went to Carolina, essentially replaced Haason Reddick in Carolina as a pass rushing off-ball linebacker, has been very productive the last 3 years in that role, averaging 7 sacks, 2 years in Carolina, this past year in Washington, and basically plays a similar role to Caden Ellis. About 16% of his snaps come as a pass rusher, similar to Caden Ellis, who's about 12% of his total snaps come as a pass rusher. But, I could have compared Jalon Walker to Caden Ellis, but I like the Louvu comp a little bit better just because I think Louvu's a little bit more physical like Jalon Walker is. Again, not elite coverage guys as off-ball linebackers, but functional, plus run defenders, and obviously major as pass rushers. And I think Jalon Walker, potentially, if long linebacker is, his full-time job eventually in the NFL. And again, that's not the plan right now, but could be the plan depending on circumstances that are unforeseen at this point in time, years down the road. I think he will specialize in that sort of Frankie Louvu type role and whatnot. So if I don't sound super optimistic about Walker, it has little to do with Jalon Walker himself. As a player, he has the talent, he has the tools to be a very productive player in a variety of different roles, can be a very useful chess piece and whatnot in the NFL. But to me, the concern is not Jalon Walker's nature. It is Jalon Walker's nurture. And that's really about the Atlanta Falcons. That we do just, I can't, it's hard to have complete confidence that Jalon Walker is going to develop into the Pro Bowl talent that he has the capability of being and the potential of being, because Atlanta has not been a stable or consistent environment to develop that talent, not only over the last, 3 to 4 years, over the last 7 or 8 years or the last decade a year, but that's a big contributing factor to why this team has not been able to successfully develop a pass rusher over the last 25 years, right? Now, I am higher on Jalon Walker post-draft than I was pre-draft, having done a deep dive in the film, but initially I wasn't sure of whether or not he was talented enough pre-draft to overcome some of these issues that we're talking about in terms of scheme fit and all that stuff. And so that's why I wasn't necessarily seeing him as a first-round talent. Now, I've come around more on that, and I think he's more than talented enough to succeed, but, I'm confident. Basically, I'm confident that he'll be a good NFL player, but I'm not quite confident that he'll be a great NFL player, not because he lacks it within him to be great, but again, it's really about the environment in that situation. Is Atlanta the place where a player like Jalon Walker can be great, because you don't know how much consistency, how much stability is going to be here in Atlanta? And so when we talk about, the greatness from within, that's going to be more of a central conversation when we talk about James Pierce next week, probably on the podcast, probably a week from today. But in the meantime, that's it for our Jalon Walker breakdown. Tomorrow, we will probably talk a little bit more with James Pierce by Locked On Vols host Eric Kane. We'll talk about some of the incredible practice reps we got from some of these guys in rookie minicamp, and potentially some roster moves if the Falcons do choose to make some after rookie minicamp. So I appreciate you guys for checking out this Jalon Walker breakdown. Please let me know in the comments and elsewhere, where you agree, where you disagree on Jalon Walker. And so I appreciate you for making Locked On Falcons your first listen. For your second listen, check out the Locked On NFL Scouting podcast. Find Locked On NFL Scouting on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. It's all part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.